Hello, welcome to Shit Happens, procedural generation in simulation games. I'm I'm Tarn Adams of Bay 12 Games, co-creator of Dwarf Fortress, and with me are two other amazing developers of video games with procedural generation elements. And so let's just start off by having you both present yourselves and go ahead and name an example of a game that struck you the most about the way they use procedural generation. Marta, go ahead.
So, hello, my name is Marta Fiak. I worked on Frostpunk a lot, on the Rimworld a little bit, and now I'm working on Timberborn, the beaver game. So now after the depression games, now I'm the beaver person. And yeah, the games that struck me the most with procedural generation, I think Curious Expedition was one of the earlier one that grabbed my heart very strongly with how it approached the text and all of the story building, and also Rimworld and Dwarf Fortress, and Rimworld in that case especially with its procedural generation toward creating drama. I found that very fascinating and very well done in that game before I joined it, just to be that I'm not tooting myself my own horn. So yeah, that would be that.
Cool. And yeah, I'm Jason Grimblad. I'm co-founder of Freehold Games, and we make Caves of Cud most for the longest time, and then also Sproggy Wood. We tend to do play in the emergent narrative space, roguelikes, procedural generation, and I guess I'll take it back to our game. If you know anything about our game, I've said many times we're very much inspired by this old pen and paper tabletop game, Gamma World, and Gamma World really struck us for. I mean, tabletop, there's a lot of procedural generation all across tabletop. You're rolling from a table anytime you're doing that. You're doing some procedural generation. But Gamma World really baked it into the game and into the character creation. You had actually relatively very little control over the fate of your character during character creation. That was really exciting. That put a certain special sauce on the whole process, and we would make characters over and over, and then the whole party would wipe within the first hour and we'd start over. But that was definitely one of the first places I think I really fell in love with procedural generation, and then started to play the computer games, the roguelikes and the Dwarf Fortress, and yeah, really getting into it from that point.
Yeah. For me, it started with roguelikes and the map generation, that kind of thing. But then just like a thing that really struck me was an old game, Starflight, that had procedural life form generation in something like 1984 or 5 or something like that. And seeing that you could do procedural generation beyond maps, you could do anything. It just kind of opened my eyes. Like, oh wait, we can do absolutely anything. And now we have games that are generating almost every element now. Like there's Wizards and Warlords, War Sim, elements of Shadow Empire that procedurally generated tech trees, procedurally generated civilizations, and I just love to see it. Love to see the kind of continuing expansion of procedural generation into every nook and cranny that you could possibly imagine. So it's cool. So I guess we'll just get started with the discussion kind of at a higher level, just to kind of set the stage here. So first let's just talk about design philosophy. Just kind of how we're thinking about procedural generation of elements in games. So what design philosophies guide your approach to implementing procedural generation in the games that you've worked on? So yeah, back to Marta. I guess we'll just go back and forth.
Yeah, so for me, it all come down to the vision of the product. I worked on mostly on things that had a more rigid production structure, so we couldn't fumble around for years. The evil producers were looking at us. So it comes down to vision. We are going to offer a certain experience. I'm promising something to a player. So now the question is, what can I procedurally generate, and why should I? Because there's also this it's bloody exciting when a computer does something that you did not expect. So I would like to put procedural generation into everything and just make the numbers go brib, numbers make the happy noises. But the question is it the most useful tool in a given situation? And if it is, if there's the replayability factor or the unique character of a story, because for me, this is the key factor of procedural generation, that the story is the players to own, and they they value it, in my opinion, much more if it's so personalized for them than if it's that. uh, then let's define what is the idea of the story. And usually in the games that I worked on, my guiding philosophy is creating the bigger and even more impressive drama out of the story. So I know what story I want to tell, and now I want to make it more dramatic and more dramatic and one up. And what if something catched fire and now everybody's on fire? So yeah, and of course, this is the problematic double-edged sword, because it's nice to see things catch fire and stories to be generated, but there's also this silly little thing of player agency and decision spaces at the game that should be engaging, and those not always come hand in hand. So that's a tricky one. But yeah, drama. That would be my philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun because it's despite doing this for a long time, it's still a pretty alive question to me, I think. I think about like what am I doing here with procedural generation? Why am I drawn to it? And I definitely resonate with making the computer do wrong things or whatever you said. That I mean, that's a big impulse, I think. And I think there's kind of like, yeah, you're doing, there are trade-offs when you're working with procedural generation, right? So I think there's something, and people have talked about this, people have written about this, the kind of like something special that happens when the experience you're having in a game was not directly authored, right? When it was kind of refracted through this series of colliding systems to produce something that feels authentic in a way. It feels personalized in a way, like you can't recreate it, that it wasn't just railroaded for you. And that's special, right? There are people, all of us included, that kind of attach to that experience. And then there's like, okay, well, what are the things that really benefit the themes or the stories or the mechanics? What are the things that really benefit from retreading with a slightly different context each time, right? There are some things, if we do them over and over again, they're not fun, and procedural generation might not be the right fit for those. But like, what is the thing that if I can turn it around from another angle and get a new perspective, it's enriched? And that I think, I mean, and I think the simplest incarnation of that in games is replayability. We like to think about like, okay, in a tactical game, for instance, like I learned some, I had a little tactical fight. I had some experience or like kind of knowledge nugget that I've learned from that. If I'm put in a new situation with the variable slightly tweaked, how does my knowledge come to bear here? And that's a pretty nice formula. And so that's a place where a series of hand design maps might suffice, but procedural generation might also be a good tool there. But then other ways in which, right, like a story, a world, when I'm thinking of, I think we kind of, because we've been making Caves of Cut for so long, a lot of the decisions that we made back then, we kind of now are forced to unpack. Now that we're kind of better designers and smarter, older people, we kind of like unpack what we did and say, why was this effective, or why did we do this? And a lot of it, like, I think we developed this weird science fantasy setting where like anything can happen. That really ends up being this kind of nice soft landing bed for a lot of the procedural generation to go wild, and then to always have like a lens to see it through. We're like, oh, well, with this future technology, anything can happen, and that's fun. Or so, yeah, I think it's this weird dialogue between what you're trying to say with your game and what is fun to do over and over in your game, and where procedural fits in with that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, for me, and it's just constant with what both of you have said. When I started out, I just wanted to be surprised by a computer. I was just a little kid, wanted it to be, ooh, and show my brother, that kind of thing. And so procedural generation was the only way to make like when you're writing games for yourself, you have to use procedural generation pretty much, because you're not going to be surprised by your story Like even if it's a branching story or something, like
Yeah.
you know what both branches do. So there's no point in doing that. Yeah, I just became drawn to a emergent narrative, and that's kind of the center of how I think about whether or not we should use procedural generation for a given feature, and how much and in what ways is just how is someone seeing this and interacting with it going to be able to sort of investigate and explore what comes out of the system to build a story in their head. And yeah, that's it's there's a lot of times when it's just not a good idea. And it's like it's like Jason just said, after some decades, your philosophy changes because you have players now, other people
The worst.
involved, and yeah, it's too bad in a way, but we like having players as well. And it's like, okay, now I need to make sure that the player can see what I'm doing, for instance. I mean, I remember I think it was Sid Meier or somebody said that you can make the game that the player wants, will enjoy. You can make a game that the designer enjoys, or you can make a game that the computer enjoys. And and I am guilty of the latter two all the time. And it's just gotta get a little bit of that player in there, and then it becomes a better. It's just something to be mindful of. But you can still enjoy yourself writing these games. That's what I try and do. Because I've found that at the times when I'm most enjoying myself and surprising myself, those are the things that resonate with other people too. I mean, so that's I'm still trying and keep a lighthearted philosophy coming in. So yeah. Um, so let's see. Yeah, yeah, I guess we'll just roll on through these through the things we want to talk about, and then just kind of chat at the end, I suppose. So let's speaking of the computer, enjoying enjoying the game a little too much maybe, and it comes right up at the first time you generate something, you'll have these problems. So technical challenges, like what are the major technical challenges you've experienced working on your games as they relate to procedural generation. I don't know if Marta wants to start every time. Now we've got two people. We'll just so we can switch to Jason and just kind of go back and forth. Yeah,
Let's
I
Yeah,
keep the
no,
yeah
excitement. Go.
yeah.
that
Okay, go
makes sense.
ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's challenges, right? Like I think the one that just jumps to mind, which is a really hard challenge, is any type of localization, right? When you're doing the um the level of procedural text generation that I think we do or you do, Dwarf Fortress, it becomes such a challenging problem because you generally localizers are taking final strings and translating them, and that's just not really possible here. So it's kind of like this deeply open question, and unfortunately limits the audience for the game you're making if you are pursuing that type of development, which that's fine, but it's an interesting problem. I think more generally, I would say you often run into a problem where you have a lot of really smart people who have written smart things about various procedural generation techniques, right? Like I think if you want to get started with this stuff, I think it's a little older now, but I think it's still really great. Kate Compton, who's a proc gen person, among other things, wrote this great blog post called like "So You Want to Build a Generator," and it just kind of walks through various proc gen techniques and what little application you might want to use them for. So that's good. You can use that. You can like learn about L trees or learn about generative grammars or whatever and implement it. But then it's like kind of hooking these things together to build these bigger Gestalt systems that are not only, oftentimes when you're doing the thing that we like to do is just like generate worlds, you're taking some aspect of the world and trying to decompose that into these systems of which these techniques kind of have to stack together in novel ways to produce something that is both simulative but also has a unique take that makes the thing you're building worth building rather than what other people have built. And then also the third thing, the player has to come back involved, right? And like you need to find a way to fit them in there. So it's like just technically juggling that can be challenging, and knowing where you want to I mean, without spinning out too much, I guess just knowing where you want to kind of put your procedural pen and really like focus on does it make sense to go deep with a procedural detail in this system when we have to build out the rest of a game that players have to have an experience with, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so jumping from that, for sure, the localization part is a tricky one, especially that, well, with all due respect, English is quite good to be cut up into pieces and rearranged in order, and it kind of works. But for example, Polish is a very, uh, it's a type of a language that words change a lot. The endings of the words, depending on many other things. So that in localization with procedural generation, that's a pain. So that's on the lighter side. Also, on a more technical side, when we are talking about visual procedural generation, we are talking about generative meshes. We are talking about a real-time generation of textures, for example, just to visualize things, not even in gameplay terms. Um, yeah, the VRAM and the graphic cards and the aspect that there are thousands of ways to store texture and all of those things catch fire. So when you add procedural generation on top of already quite difficult technical artist aspects, it just quadruples the mess. But I think for me the main thing, because I work on like with bigger amount of people on a project with procedural generation. For example, in Anusha Studios we had like a procedural dungeon generation. There's also an NDA there, so you haven't heard that. We're good that no procedural generation with the dungeon, but
Absolutely.
uh, the thing is, if those procedural generation systems are not purely visual, they are connected to gameplay, it's very hard to work on them in parallel. So I've got a team of designers, but one of those teams is exploring the procedural generation, and no one knows where they're going to be in 3 weeks. They're going to poke one thing, another stone is going to, turn another ray. Jesus, sorry, another way around, and instead of a dungeon, they will come back with an amazing snowman, and now the rest of the team will have to adapt because that's a brilliant snowman. And as so from the production perspective, when you are looking on those budgets and those pesky producers and all of that, that for me is a huge challenge with working at it on a bigger scale. So this is why I usually on those bigger projects it goes to like spaces that you can cut out neatly and have just few or connections to other systems, so you can keep that snowman in there. It's hard to have it like on the core level of the game.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, we have to adapt as we add things, because sometimes things are just too good. I mean, especially with bugs, you get bugs all the time, right?
Yeah.
In these games, and sometimes you're just like, I must keep this bug. I must figure out how to keep this bug and how to wrap the rest of the game around the preserving and featureification of the bug. But yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, there's yeah, all those issues, of course. Like we haven't attempted localization. I know RimWorld did, and I talked to Tynan briefly about that, and there's a whole thing there to get that like to get that to even work on a basic level, right? It's a really difficult problem. And for me, I just also like to give a basic shout out to data structures and just storing data, and how like if you're making objects that have random properties, you need to figure out how to store them, and then usually you make a lot of them too, and so you've got these things all connected together, and we're talking about simulation games, so they are connected together. They are supposed to be connected together in all sorts of different ways. It's hard enough if you're handcrafting a simulation, like if you're doing some modeling or
Yeah.
something like that. Modeling is hard. Modeling goes slow notoriously, and there's just horrible data sets. And now we're like, oh, but I would also like to throw, creatures with arbitrary amounts of arms into this mix, which yeah, we've maybe all done in this room at some point or another. So it's like I mean, how do you even do it? And then because things like modding are so popular these days, we also need file structures and scripts and things that make that usable on a to people players on the outside. which we've kind of dropped the ball on initially in Dwarf Fortress. Like all of our procedural creatures are hard coded, but that's not always going to be the case. So it's everything that you think about when you want to procedurally generate a game, you have to think of about 15 different things that you're like different trucks that are about to hit you. And you just
But this explosion is so beautiful, and there's a
yes.
happy snowman on top of that. I love those
Yeah.
explosions.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I'm not saying you step out of the way of the trucks either. You just, yes, you have to, become one with the
Embrace.
truck.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I said
It's
that's where like the different scales of projects really kind of like allow for different things, right? Because
Yeah.
like yeah, I think graphics are such a like pinch on what you can do, and like you know the flip side is that you get visualization that players engage with, right? So we do a lot of stuff that's really abstract, and we're just describing it with text because we have these body morphologies that right are gaining another arm and frills and roots, and like we're like, well, we're gonna have a tile to represent that. That's pretty abstract, and then tell you about it in text. Maybe you could do a little better than that, you know, with a little bit of composing visually. Yeah, I mean, it starts to get extremely
Um,
challenging.
like Rimworld. Rimworld is a little bit less abstract, but
Yeah.
still quite abstract. But I think it's a scale. The more we move to those movie-like experiences, the more there's graphic fidelity, but less and less freedom in those stories, so to say. But those games need to take away the time from movies on Netflix or from another blockbuster that are in the same bucket. And when we are offering the things from the other end, those things that are drawn with letters, but we are offering something extremely personal and those stories that are yours to have. No one is going to see that snowman with 7 arms and a truck instead of a head. And that makes it special. And I think players are a lot more lenient, that would be the word in English. I'm not sure. You have to trust me on that.
Mhm.
Towards less impressive visualizations.
Yeah, mostly.
Most. Yeah.
There were people are going, well, where are the different colored stones, and so forth. It's like there's yeah, people all have different. Well, I think that's I mean that might be instructive in the sense that like why was that? That just came to mind because it was a question someone recently asked, and I'm like there are so many other things that could be represented, but that one, and it's because I think of where it intersects the player again because they want to be artistic
Hmm.
and the game is currently not allowing them to do that.
Mm.
So that kind of points back toward sort of the choices in graphical fidelity when you have no way to represent everything. Then you have various stakeholders. You want your players either icon or their little people running around or whatever to look cool and to kind of represent both their sort of functional and aesthetic sort of
Yeah.
like if you want a dwarf with an axe, you want a dwarf with an axe, and it's good to see it. We used to just make them blue. Now they have a little
Mhm.
axe. Either way they were represented. But people do want to see like if they've got an amazing sort of marble, hall, and it's gray and not beautiful and white or something. There, it's just like
Yeah. Yeah, but that's the pesky players, but that's that aspect of
yes.
player expression and that creativity and those games with that procedural generation and especially the simulation games allow that. And
Mhm.
this is also because this is the emergent gameplay situations and emergent narrative is kind of for me another thing that makes me excited because again the game with the player involved makes something that no one expected and you are like okay, 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 and it doesn't have to be driven with procedural generation, right? You can have those things without that.
Yeah, well, especially if there's other people. I mean, kind of the emergent narrative. It came from a lot of different places, obviously, but since this is TactiCon, and yeah, check out TactiCon. No, the like war games are actually one of the places that all this stuff started because
Yeah.
people would just be sitting around a table and multiplayer strategy games, you have these things like after action reports, I think they
Mm-hmm.
call them. And then you just write up the whole story because you're like, oh, this is alternate history or something. And because you have all of real history to riff on, you're like, oh, wow, this happened this time. Da, 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 da. And that kind of went in and inspired directly things like Dungeons and Dragons and out into the rest of us here. Because that it came out of those spaces originally, like with chainmail or whatever. I don't remember the order of these games, but I know that they came out of those spaces. And yeah, I mean, so it's kind of it doesn't require procedural generation. It requires randomness in some way.
Yeah.
This time it's the other players, and dice. I mean,
Right.
dice are procedural generation, but it's yes. Anyway, yes.
Well, it's an
Thread,
interesting point.
thread,
I think it is an interesting point that like the experience of procedural generation, we think very tightly tied to a certain type of randomness, a certain type of algorithmic approach. But yeah, there is something about it like kind of experientially being just like I am taking actions, I'm engaging with the system and how it responds to me is a little uncertain. And right, that can be you can get that effect through other like just interactivity or like with other players or something. And there was like those dynamics all produce a sort of similar texture of experience, right? And I think that's a lot of what if you're sitting down and just talking with your friends and creating a story and riffing on what each other's saying, there's no procedural generation there unless maybe you're adding dice. But there's this kind of like emergence and kind of like adaptation to the inputs you're getting and then like changing the outputs and that play, I think procedural generation ends up feeling a lot like and also like augmenting that texture.
Yeah, Frostpunk created quite a lot of emergent stories. People assigned whole story arcs to characters in that game, but there's no procedural generation in there. There's a lot of just static pieces of content that show consequences of certain actions that are picked depending on some. There's not a lot of randomness, but they are picked on some set of rules, and that bunch just there's like 200 of them, and a subset will show depending on the choices of the player. In the context of the overarching narrative, created very personal stories for the player, even though that Frostpunk is not a huge game in terms of content and in terms of amount of things that are in there. But that's the power of the Kuleshov effect, right? We need something in context, and the context creates the story. So it's a powerful force, and we don't need procedural generation to that. Still, though, procedural generation is very cool, and we should apply it everywhere because numbers make happy noises.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's sort of indistinguishable at first, the first time you play through a game like that. I mean, it could have been procedurally generated, and even though it wasn't. So
Yeah.
as long as it feels responsive, and I guess
Yeah.
that's the thing, is like this responsiveness, which is another difficulty with procedural generation, because when you're handcrafting things, you can think about stuff, but when you're procedurally generating events, for instance, you need to offload the thinking to the computer, and the computer is not smart. It's not. So, I mean, the computer is smart as you are with thick gloves on, typing rules into it, and it's just not great. But yeah, the trade-offs are immense. I mean, the positive there. So yeah, I think the just kind of re-railing things now, we're on a natural pause. So talking about like this procedural generation and how it interfaces with the player, like how do you strike the balance there with player agency and and things that you're generating, like do you have any insights into that? And I don't even remember who's next here, if someone
I
has
I
think,
think it's
yeah,
Marta, right? Yeah.
this time it's me. I'm the one. Yeah, so it depends what part. I come from the school of thought from the aesthetic of play from Brian Upton's book, and I strongly believe that the engagement comes from anticipatory play. So if the procedural generation is kind of creating the backbone for that, so for example the world, the monsters, all of those things, then the only thing that I'm interested in is proper communication of the things that were generated. So the player will exist in a state of not full set of information, right? Because there is some kind of a surprise, but they need to be able to make informed decisions that this tile is a trap or a normal path, right? Just the basic ones out from them. And then when adding certain other systems, if it's prog gen or not, uh, I want to see what kind of interesting decisions the player can make within that system. What is the story that I can put in my mind that I want to do that, and this will happen, right? So with procedural generation, what can happen is I will cut it very quickly. So the player can only plan like 2 actions because everything is too random. And suddenly there's the snowman, the eating the children, and I was not able to prepare for that, right? Maybe
That
with a
sounds good.
truck.
I mean, sounds good to me. Yeah, I was like,
Yeah, but if it's 1 in a million situation that I cannot learn to prepare for the snowman,
yeah.
then it's awkward. So for me,
Mhm.
it's striking the balance how long in time I can kind of predict things and how dramatic are the things that happen. I don't want to have situations that there's a fail that the player cannot do anything about it. So the procedural generation decided that there's a meteor coming. That's not that may be fun at the end. Not a final meteorite, like a half of meteorite. That may be cool, but a full one. Mm-mm. There was this issue with one of the democracy games that one out of nowhere you got just shot by an assassin, and it was so obfuscated. Like you were president, everything was cool. I know that kind of makes sense in terms of history, but the communication of that system was as such that it came out of nowhere, and that part is not fun usually getting shot in the head. So yeah, that was a tangent. Sorry, yeah, I hope something made sense out of
Oh.
that.
Yeah. Let me so like what where do we decide to form procedural generation around the player agency? That's kind of what we're getting at, or
Yeah, yeah.
how much and how little. Yeah. I think coming from the RPG world, not I mean with the CRPG world, right? Like making an RPG, there's kind of a natural division there where, right, we can generate the dungeons, we can generate the world for you, and then you as a player can be kind of stable and go and moving through it, and that's a pretty engaging experience. But it is interesting to think through when it makes sense to even do that. I tend to really like my favorite peak procedural generation moments in watching people play our game is when they come into some procedural situation. Maybe it's a dungeon that has been generated, and they read it, they kind of read what's going on, and then they do a lot of like creative interpretation about what's happening, and kind of, I think it's been called before, as Max Kreminski is a proc gen person calls it, extrapolative narration, where you're kind of like narrating your gameplay and then something happens and there's no real games turns through it necessarily, but I'm going to kind of riff on it and decide what's happening, and then kind of that's informing the like author's voice in my head. That's kind of understanding this experience, and that's really fun to me, especially when players can start to do that in the voice of your game, right? To kind of value what your game values. So like I remember the situation where the streamer had come into a dungeon, or like they were in a cave underground. It's Caves of God, and some of the like half the walls along one cavern were holographic, and that just like it just blew their mind, because they were like, why someone had produced these holographic projections of shale? So what were they doing in this space? It must be some sort of like tinker who was hiding here from, and like on the generation level, it was much dumber than that, in that it was like we will sometimes do this fun thing. We'll make some of the walls in a map holographic, because why not, right? Like, and we're kind of, I think of that type of generation is like posing a question, right? It's like, why are the walls holographic here? And then the player, hopefully you've enriched the player enough with tone and with, you know, the mechanics of your game and the experience you're going for, to give them the sort of creative expression to answer that question in an interesting way, right? It's not just that you're throwing a bunch of garbage at them and asking them to interpret it. It's that you're throwing a bunch of, like, particularly, you know, textured garbage at them and asking them to understand what they're doing there. But then I also, just to get back one more thing, to get back to this core question of like, when are you going to, why are you procedurally generating it? I do think that there's something about the sort of core, when we think of like modularity, right? We think of like, we generate a lot of things that are individually maybe kind of stable, but the way that we combine them produces something new, right? Legos are kind of the most canonical example, but also, you know, anything, right? Like equipment in an RPG is modular, right? You wear a bunch of different equipment and it produces your character's loadout, and that has a certain effect or not, right? I like having those stable units. Those, I think Tanya Short has called those units of meaning. Really thinking hard about what you want your core units of meaning to be, because they're kind of like the tarot suits of your world, right? Like they're really, you can inject a lot, you can author a lot through those, even though you're not authoring at the sort of same granularity that a game without procedural generation might be. But you can say a lot through them, and then you can kind of train your players. This is how you like speak in the language of the game, and this is how you interpret an experience, and that can go a long way in when you do have a lot of rich generation built on top of that.
Yeah, so yeah, just a couple random yeah, not random, but just remarks, I guess, that I was thinking was like with the holographic walls. What came to mind is when you see that, you know, if you're designing and you know, iterating on the game. I mean, one of the first things you might think is, well, what if the holographic walls were there for a reason? And you can start thinking like, well, I can generate a bunch of reasons why there'd be holographic walls, and then things would cohere more behind the holographic wall. Like, what if there's a little Tinker's hideout behind it and stuff like that? And then you find your game constrained down into these smaller units of outcomes that, in a way, it's better and worse. And this is where it just gets hard to write these kind of games, because like the randomized juxtaposition of basic elements that produces a lot of like that story. It just came from just complete sort of randomized juxtaposition of tile types, right? And like that gets you a certain distance, but then as a designer you can't build on that. And that's a thing I have with a lot of the generation algorithms in general. It's not to mention the whole like current AI craze and stuff. Like how to find units of meaning and little hooks off of the ends of the things you've generated to build more, means that you need your initial object to be more constrained, which sucks the magic out of your game, but gives you more potential. So you're like trading magic and potential for each other, and it's yeah, that's, I mean, that's simply difficult to do.
I think let me
Yeah.
to jump in. Oh, Marta, do you want to
No,
say
please
something?
go first.
Okay.
That's fine.
Yeah, I think there's something real, because I think a lot of time it's interesting, right? Right. Your game, I mean, how I'm interpreting what you're saying is that your game generates some interesting result, right? Does the game have any way to then re-understand that and build on that, right? And yeah, that's really interesting, because on the one hand, the game not understanding, this is kind of tricky to articulate, but I think it's important. Like the game not understanding the result is where some of the magic happens, because then it's like, oh, I didn't author it. I didn't tell you that the combination of like I can't come up with an example offhand, right? But like, you know, fire on, I don't know, whatever. when there's some combination that's really fun, that's really interesting, that is really just a collision of the systems, and it's not the game saying like, well, this is what it happens when these two things collide. It's really fun. But yeah, it's like you almost want some sort of then like interpreter module in your game that like exists. There's like a sort of firewall between the two that can then come and reinterpret the output in a way that doesn't like have its finger on the scale because it generated the output, and do something with that. And I think one approach for that I've seen games or like people who are working in some of the experimental spaces here like allow the player to kind of like give some input, right? Like, oh, I produced this thing, I'm going to annotate that, or I'm going to tell the computer that this was valuable for me, and I want you to like generate more based on that note. And of course, that that kind of swerves into this idea of authorship play, where the player is taking on more of an author role, because when we're talking about emergent narrative, we're kind of asking the player to some extent to be the author, and how explicit you want that to be in your game can changes the texture of the experience, right? Like if I'm making an RPG, so I tend not to want you to feel like you can press on the world and like be godlike, right? Because then it kind of ruins the embodiment of the character. But in other games where maybe like, I think of games like Microscope or some of these collaborative TTRPGs where like you're very clearly authoring the world as the gameplay, and having the affordance of coming in to say like, oh, we did something cool, let's now like really embed that into what it means to be in this world. Like that can be powerful.
Yeah, and I wanted to riff off that magic and potential because this is a very nicely stated tension for me, but also I come from games that touch very delicate subjects or talk about human nature or are rather serious in tone, so to say. And there's also this issue of systems saying things that you wouldn't want them to say. That's a very problematic thing with emergent gameplay and emergent narratives, especially when this story that you want to deliver, this experience is like a mature one. There's not, I'm not saying that that's more valuable, there's just a certain thing. And suddenly, in that very dramatic situation, if you are lucky, your procedural generation is going to make something funny that will be immersion breaking. And if you are not lucky, you are going to make something extremely offensive and something that is quite horrible. And this is why sadly, you have to be a no fun committee in those cases sometimes, and just yep, no more magic for you. That's the thing that can happen, because that's the the question of responsibility of authorial voice in system design. If yeah, we should show everything, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's difficult because it's the two things. I mean, there are many approaches, but two things like you have the pre-constraints when you're setting up the generator to block certain outputs, and then as like Jason mentioned, the kind of post-interpreter, if you can try and
Mm.
detect them at a later
Yep.
time in the process. And both those things, I mean, those are two impossible problems. That's great because I mean, when it's less serious, like as a simple example, just to point out, like Dwarf Fortress spins up a world and rejects some of them. They simply it threw the stuff together and it said, oh wait, the forest count is way too low here. Toss it. And the reason we went that way is so that we preserve all of the randomness of the system. Like we're not trying to say like, well, I want to have dollops of forest here, here, and here at a 1-to-3 ratio. We're just like, if it ends up being 25-50, cool, keep going. And then it lets the space breathe, but you can't do that with other things.
Well,
Yeah.
it depends on how on how like strict your interpreter is, right? You could throw out 90% of it. I mean, it becomes an efficiency problem, right? But
Oh
I
yeah.
do,
Oh sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. I think that I love that you do that, and I think there's something really what's emerging out of this discussion for me is like, I mean, like in some sense, this is kind of a lot of procedural work works this way because there's different modules that do different things, and it makes sense that you would have some sort of like constraints that you're putting on your generation that then you're throwing out. But I do think having these kind of distinct, I almost think about like the Disco Elysium like traits that are
Mm,
talking to each other, right? Like having these distinct personalities in your systems and like on the generation level is, I think, like an interesting metaphor that kind of works well because you're really tapping into this idea of like we are making as best or like as interesting of like a terrain generator as we can, and that's kind of the clay we're giving the player to like mold their story. And part of what's special about that is that it's just clay. It's not, you're not giving them the story, right? You're not giving them the settlement. You're not giving them what a nice little settlement tucked into the perfect forest would be like. Maybe you're throwing, you're smoothing the edges because you're giving them enough clay that for each world that they're able to do that. But like preserving that like really explicitly in your code, even that like we're not going to bake in the putting the finger on the scale in this module, at least, I think is a nice pattern that people might want to think about when they're doing this type of work.
Yeah, I mean it's you have to put fingers on scales, but when and where, it's all, yeah, it's just you can try and just get the picture of what you're generating running in your head and then see it and then re incorporate that into your mental model, and you just, yeah, I mean it just takes a lot of practice to get the outputs going the way you want, but and it's all imperfect anyway. And one other thing I want to give a shout out for before we move on to the next thing we could talk about is when you're talking about anticipatory play, and talking about making sure the player has enough tools to understand what's coming at them so that they can make decisions and things aren't too random. I mean, like they're not just suddenly dying or something. It's just like it's a good kind. It's a game. You want good interplay there. And kind of I found a twin to that, especially when we're talking about emergent narrative, is that after stuff has happened and not thinking about the next move, but the
mm-hmm.
after stuff has happened, giving people the same tools to look at what's happened in the way that they want so that they can write the stories they want. That's why you have like little combat reports and little indicators and
Yep.
lots of little question marks and things to click. And the problem here is that you don't know what the players want. You don't
Mm-hmm.
know what kind of, I mean, you know what game you're trying to write. Like combat's a big deal in Dwarf Fortress, so we have a top level like combat readout. But putting that at the top level of the interface, because you only have so much screen real estate, uh, is a decision which makes Dwarf Fortress more of a combat game than a different type of game, and that's a decision that makes us, we have big plans for the game, and that's probably going to become less of a thing at some point or something. And it's just like there's a lot of tension between where your buttons are, and because we've got other investigatory tools like 4 or 5 layers deep, and we had a streamer who'd been playing the game for 20 years and didn't know one of them existed.
Uh,
And
UI and UX design is a whole thing on its own, but uh, even yeah, the player needs to have to investigate what happened, but I think even what is crucial is giving them a little bit of breathing space. If you just make a thing, there's no time to reflect. Rimworld does it with a rather depending on the AI module that is making you suffer, it has those pauses in there in that procedural generation of the events to give you that moment too. In case of Rimworld, this is not a battle report. This is just checking on the corpses and see what is missing. But you get the idea. And yeah, the UI and UX stuff on top of that is another can of worms.
yeah, it's just a pause button. I mean, that's things that when people think about the value of a pause button, it's like there if in a real time game, of course, like there's so many different things that come into play when you think about the time, like the timing structures, but that's one of them. I mean, I in Dwarf Fortress Spacebar, the reason we use the biggest key is because we want people to just be like slap, okay. This is a hectic game, but donk, panic, donk. And now people can spend 2 hours at a stretch paused in Dwarf Fortress just checking things out, just to see like, okay, like this is what happened, or they see a trail of blood somewhere and they're like, what happened? And after some investigation, and then yeah, I mean that carries on to things like Legends mode, where people read through the whole history of the world to see what happened with people, and there's no gameplay at all in a sense, unless I mean strictly speaking, broadly speaking,
Mhm.
of course that's a game. But yeah, it's so that's yeah.
Yeah, I think reflection is key, right? Like that's really important to understand how we make meaning of these experiences. There's like the narrator in our head that's explaining what's happening as it's happening, and that changes maybe once we've had some time to reflect on it. And you can, I think it's really interesting when games build that into their game. I think of like, yeah, I know like you fall in London and you have your your pieces you could put on your mantle, right? You can choose from the experiences you've had to show what was meaningful to you, and that's like an interesting, I think, thinking through that, right? Thinking like designing the pacing of your game such that you had a wild thing happen, the player had the chance to like experience it, and now like yeah, let's slow down and make some meaning of that and memorialize it maybe. And I think ritual, the idea of ritual comes up a lot when talking about games in general, but also like I think particularly procedural generation is like coming back and like doing the thing over, getting the new context, like getting, seeing something from a different angle, and yeah, having moments to slow it all down. Because the thing about computers, this is, I think we're kind of seeing this a little bit with the AI, with the with the AI stuff going, is that like what computers do is generate things really fast, and a lot of them. And like once it knows how to do something, it can give you hundreds of thousands of it. And so we're not really, if you're hit on the head with 100,000 things, they all turn to oatmeal, has been said, or they're it's hard to attach meaning to them. So you really want to slow down and come and take one games have this nice thing where they kind of get this let's say tactic games at least, get this for free because they're hard, right? And so like you have to kind of, there's a lot of friction, and then you might lose, and then you have to kind of start over. And so you by their nature, they're slow. They could generate for you 100,000 maps in a minute, right? And just like hit you over the shoot you with a fire hose with them. But like the gameplay has encoded like in it the friction to navigate through them in this slow ritualistic way. And then you have then maybe also moments to reflect on what happened there, and kind of like really building those moments in to reflect, I think, is a cool opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, I remember like playing like back in the old Ultima games or whatever, the first one where you could pick up an object and drop it, like being able to like then setting up my house, right? Just being able to put things in there and drop them and so forth. And just taking time to do that in those games. And this would be in like, I don't know, 1991 or something. And then and of course that continued on into, I mean, there's like the Elder Scrolls houses famously, but then also like Minecraft or something, right? You just have a giant space that you're thinking of, and that's like when you have the power to move things or the power to change an aspect of the world, even if you can't move a single object at all. It's like the whole play space can become like this sort of canvas for the person to work with. And that doesn't have necessarily anything to do with procedural generation at all. It's just that the procedural generation gives you kind of interplay
Mhm.
backward when you're doing that. That makes it invigorating in a particular way.
Mhm.
That's different from painting on a blank canvas, a thing that you chose. So yeah, yes, very good.
No, I think that's the power of simulation games, right? That responsiveness of a system. If the underlying system is very simplistic, there's no exploration and there's no aha moments when you are painting what you would like to paint, and there's more of just using a software to create what you want. The game is missing. But in case of Minecraft, there's a lot of that. And what would that do? And what would that do? There's a very simplistic set of relations and simulations inside of there between those objects. And for Timberborn, this is water. Like in Timberborn, the game about beavers, there's like a 3D water system, and how water behaves is not like fully grasped by people. People don't think in physics like, okay, this is the amount, this is the pressure that will create. So they play with it, right? So they put a box here, put a box here, and they're like, and do it over and over again. And I see a lot of power in that playful simulation aspect, with or without procedural generation.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I love it when we get people in Dwarf Fortress because they don't think the water's going to come back up the tube the other side.
Yes, that's personal for me. That's painful. Thank you for reminding me about
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, it's great. I love it.
Mhm. Uh, the first time I played, I stacked up milk for the winter because I thought they will drink milk. Yeah.
Mm,
Yeah, they all died out first for people who haven't played. Dwarves
we
don't
try
drink
we try
milk.
we try our very best
Thank you.
to satisfy.
Thank
But
you.
yeah, and yeah, and that yes, natural segue into narrative tone. So this is a question I think, given the games that both of you have worked on, just kind of an open for both of you really. The like so much can happen in procedural games, and we talk about intentionally leaving the generators like the ability to kind of run wild sometimes. So what are the things that you do, technically, philosophically, however you'd like, to keep the narrative tone where you want it to be, like consistently? You have like a genre you're working in, you have moods you're going for, and how do you get your systems to achieve these goals? Yeah. And Jason, is it Jason this time?
Yeah,
Yes.
I think
Go
so.
go go for it.
Yeah, that's tough. A lot because a lot of that is like, there's the thing as a designer where like a lot of times you're working, oh, it depends on who you are, but we're working sort of intuitively and oh that feels good. That feels like I want to generate that and that doesn't. I think though it is kind of this co-constitutive process where the more I realize is like, we made a setting that works well for the certain type of procedural generation we use. And I think that's something to think about, right? If you have an idea, like you love being surprised by the computer, you love procedural generation, you want to make a game. I also love random setting, right? I think that's not what you want to do. I think you really want to think deeply about like, um, is this a world or a theme or a whatever that can benefit from these retreads that I think in terms of story, what I call story volumes, right? Like you have your story volume, which is like this big 3D object that contains all these story lines in it, right? But like the volume itself, you've shaped your generator shapes, right? It maybe leans into the space of like certain like a body horror, let's say, and so you're going to have a lot of uh emergent narratives about that. And making sure that there's reason for that to be a volume and not just to be a line. I don't think that's always the case, and actually I think find it quite interesting to think through like what are the narratives that really benefit from the kind of ballooning of the storyline into a volume. What why are they better if you do this, right? You could come up with like a few things jump out immediately, right? Like if you want to do a story about multiple perspectives, like I think of Rashomon or something, like you could imagine that being something that could play well with the volume idea, right? Or like time travel, multiple possibility, like there's not, maybe not time travel, but like alternate realities, that type of thing, like alternate takes on a subject. So I think it's kind of both thinking through, okay, well, we have this science fantasy world where we're kind of playing with magic, sufficiently advanced technology being indistinguishable from magic. We every time you encounter something new that in this like the wild world of what is possible with the technology or with the biodiversity in our game, you then kind of can roll back and think, well, what did this mean for the far past where the people who created this or the people who seeded this world to be what it is? You're kind of in constant contact with that question. And so like that gives us a lot of freedom to do a lot of weird generation, but at the same time, then it's like, okay, but cyber dinosaur doesn't feel quite right? It doesn't, like, that's something that, and like if a modder wants to do it, that's where the modern modding tools let the dinosaurs reign. But for us, like that's like for me, it just doesn't, it feels like in the not fully unpacked voice of the game that we have, that sits outside it. That's playing with tropes and genre in a way that just we aren't in our inspirations, and so like that's not a space I would want to go to narratively.
Yeah, so I very like the concept of volume that you are saying. I always thought it as a possible threats in the horizon of decision play. So using that volume metaphor, which I find very nice, we shape it by both the systems and the content, and the rules that we are creating are already a form of an authorial voice and very strongly set the tone. What I decide, what happens X, if X, then Y, right? How people, for example, react if someone else's dies. If my game is more serious, then this will have implications on a systemic side. If not, then they will have human meat farms, right? And with those, a valid strategy. So with those and with content that we put inside of those, this volume is shaped. What is the possible narrative that will come out from those fixed static story points, and from all of those things that came out as an element of emergent gameplay and emergent narrative? And with my experience, the more serious you want to make the game, even the more precise the given experience you want to give, right? So not just a survival of a colony, a survival of set of beavers, or story about building a dam, but if you want to comment on something particular in the world or some particular phenomenon, then this volume is more and more becoming a sausage, right? There's still a wiggle room, because I find this the biggest value of games, that we have this adaptability, that this is the magic of what we do, but still more of a sausage to keep this tone consistent. And the more the core experience is broad, then the thing is getting bigger and bigger to create, to have those possible stories. So yeah, the conscious design of systems and content. It's so broad that it almost doesn't mean anything. I'm sorry, but what is important is that systems say something. They have meaning in them, and it's important to have this systemic meaning consistent with the vision of the game. Because if it's not, then there's going to be a dissonance in all of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You need to have your kind of guiding lights, and I mean it's just not just about content and tone, but even things like just how the game plays. Like one of our principles is just dwarven autonomy. A dwarf should be as autonomous as possible, and the player is, quote, the official will of the fortress, and that got us a long way. Like we can do a lot with that, and you, if you don't violate those rules, you get what you get, and it's like Dwarf Fortress is considered a very zany game, but we have added zero zany elements. I think it would fall apart if we ever intentionally tried to do anything zany or non sequitur, or breaking the fourth wall, any of that stuff. I think the game would fall apart. And because it's already so chaotic and so strange, that but I mean, you get different. I mean, other people get much different mileage out of a different set of rules, and as long as you're consistently applying them, it's fine. I mean, but it is something people don't realize at first when they're making even a map generator. Like, there's a lot. You're saying a lot. You're just saying an awful lot when you do anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the yes, the wonder and artistry
I think
of procedural generation. Yeah, go right ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think that the idea of like taking yourself serious, like, well, no, I mean, that's not like quite the right way to say it, but like allowing a certain seriousness um for the internal world, like, actually is quite important, right? Like, and because that, yeah, like generate the type of world generation we're talking about in the games we're talking about tend toward chaos, and they tend toward, what people are tend to attach to are these fail cases of like wild interesting things happening. But like, all that really does need to be sort of read against, well, I don't want to say has to, but like, I think often succeeds because it's read against a world that is internally pretty like real at feeling and serious, and like the dwarves don't, you know, spinning out of control and running out of the fortress on fire. Like they're not like, that's something that is odd to them, and or at least it might be an everyday occurrence, but it's something that feels wrong to them. And the same way we do the same, you know, I think our game probably goes more into the meta places than like the like lean, not quite looking at the camera, but like playing with the form maybe a little more explicitly than your game. But it's still very like most of the time, I mean, games can contain multitudes, and you can have a lot of varying tones. And you know, I always use Twin Peaks as the example for this, right? Like how Twin Peaks can be like super zany, like, you know, agent, what the hell's it, Cooper, like with his coffee and pie or whatever, but then like clearly spin back into this much different place. And the two, it's not always clear that the two are like feeding into one cohesive whole, but it does work that way ultimately, right? And I think that's because we're just very multitudinal creatures that can experience things that are vastly different at the same time. And but I am spending a lot of time when I'm thinking about the world of CUD in like a pretty serious mode, right? Like I'm thinking of this in terms of like, you know, that's just a big through line in the world building. And so then when the zany stuff happens on top of that, it's all the better because it's read against that realness.
Yeah. So yeah, I think now we can basically open the floor if anyone has any thoughts or observations moving forward here. Anything any of y'all wanted to say about procedural generation in simulation games that you think we didn't touch upon that was important, for instance?
I think like there's this interest, so maybe not for simulation games specifically, but tactics. When I think of tactics, right, like, you know, I know that our game is very tactical, right? Like, we're very much coming. It's a turn-based roguelike. It's very, the combat is deep in its DNA, even though the game has kind of expanded narratively beyond that. And like kind of like you were saying, like there's some choices we made early on that now we're like, we really trained the player to like think that combat is the center of the game, and that it's a brutally hard game, and that draws a lot of people. That also turns a lot of people away. But like, I think, you know, when you think of a tactical game, and when you think of a game that has pretty clear like win-loss scenarios, it is a sort of challenge in encouraging players to explore and to do the sort of experimental play that a lot of times procedural generation thrives with, because there's, you know, tactics can converge onto optimal strategies, and you can put all this beautiful stuff in your game, but if it's always best to go and get the shotgun, then, you know, you're training your players to in the language of your game, and you know they're going to do that. And so it's interesting to think through ways of setting goals for your players that encourage or like dovetail a little better with the exploration of the possibility space, where sometimes it's not just, and that could be like a way to do that. I think this was mentioned earlier, is to make failure fun in its own way. If failure is not just you died, restart the level, but if failure is like, oh, I got an interesting result and have to work with that, which I think happens a lot in a game like a management game, where like you're not, a bad decision is not necessarily just killing your fortress, but it is making things a lot more challenging, right? But like, yeah, I think finding ways that are not just, you know, the way you could do it with like achievements or whatever, or just like very ham-fisted goals of like, don't use the shotgun this time. How about that? Right? Like, okay, you could do that in conducts and like that those work
Yeah.
too.
Well,
But like, yeah.
I think something you did actually that was kind of stark and really useful that way is just adding a wanderer mode where there are no enemies, right? It's just, I mean, I don't know how often that's played, but even having it there, like you see the three options or whatever it is now, you see that there, and you're like, this game can be played without combat. That's always something that's interesting to hear when you hear about pacifist runs too. When you hear like there is another way of playing this game, even if I'm going to play in the traditional way, it lets you know like there is this whole other thing going on. There's more to do, and I think that that was just a big sign post for me sitting there that that's just like, okay, this is doable. And I think something that also comes out of like procedural generation games, especially as well, are just kind of simulation games with a lot of rules that is underutilized, but some people do pick it up sometimes, is just that either doing configuration in the beginning or having modes, you have a lot more available than you actually are aware of. Like, I was intrigued when Stellaris, for instance, the space strategy game Paradox, like flat out on their start screen, you can just you can say, I want no AI opponents. And I'm like, this is a 4X game, which is what like all the X's are bad, right? It's just like exploit, exterminate, and stuff like that. Like I don't remember what they are, but they're bad, a lot of them. And it's like, but no AI opponents. What does that mean? And I played through a game when it was a lot of fun. I just played, I expanded, discovered they have a billion science storylets and archaeological dig sites, and I just kind of had my plants and snails or whatever going around finding little planets with like you can uplift a new AI opponent that's so far behind you it doesn't threaten you, and then
Mm.
but then you can incorporate them into your empire and they become like president of the snails or whatever, this weird plant thing or whatever. And you could just kind of I had a great deal of fun playing it as a non 4X game. And I
Mm.
think I think there's a lot of room in a lot of games to kind of expand their horizons with very minimal effort. I mean, that was just really what was the effort on their part there, except you
Mhm.
know, just just a little one lever, and they've got a whole new game.
Yeah.
But I think that that issue with degenerative strategies, so that winning strategy that is always there, it's kind of a bane of our existence, and it exists not only on in procedural generation games, but in all games in general. So there are two things. For me in here, one thing is that the thing that I tell my students that all games are finishable. Like you can finish a game, and always a game, if it's not multiplayer, will have a form of degenerative strategy, right? It may be hard to obtain due to randomness and yada yada, but it's always there, so it's not something to be afraid of. But yeah, the second situation is when they appear quite quickly and they collapse the decision space, and that the players are not playing, not experimenting because it is there. At least in my designer opinion, is what happens. And when I see such a situation, I will tweak the numbers, switch up the enemies if I can make it more like, force you to rethink your tactics, rethink your strategy, throw a rock into you. And what then happened is I see players, and a lot of them do not care at all about a winning strategy. They do not care about making things the optimal way with shotgun. They're playful. They want to have fun. If there's no pressure, there's no like a lot of external pointing them to, yeah, a shotgun, or you are losing all of your progress for the past 25 years. You are restarting your life, right? Then they will do silly things and they will play on their own. So sometimes I think, how much is it my internal fear of the degenerative strategies, and how much it's an actual problem for players. So
I
yeah.
think I think when you find yourself in that situation that the player, I think that's a great place to find yourself in, that you've really done something good. Because I I didn't, I think it comes to the origins of your game and everything, but I often find that players, I mean, I find a bit of both, right? I'm surprised sometimes where there are certain, so there's a thing that with procedure, a challenge I often run into is that if you have a little procedural randomized element and it's visible from the absolute beginning of your game, the player can hit reroll and just carve out most of
Mhm.
the possibility space. So we used to have random mutations just like Gamma World did. And the thing about Gamma World is you're all you have this consensus reality, you're all agreeing to it. You're like, it takes a while to make a character. In our game, you just hit re-roll until you get teleportation, and then okay, well that's a problem. So we made it so that you need to we have a random mechanism, but like the mutations don't develop until level 5 or whatever, so you can't quite do that. Um, but oh my gosh, I think I lost the thread on where I was going with this. It was really key to the point I wanted to make. Uh, let's see. What was the thing you would refresh where you ended?
Yeah, I was talking about that maybe the problem with the generative strategies is inside of me and not such a big
Yes,
problem with the
yes.
players.
Right, exactly. So the example I wanted to give was that I always am very careful about anything random that I give at the start, like starting gear, for instance. But I found that um, there's a lot of variability in starting gear, but there's it's almost like the messy room situation where there's a lot of like if you put enough variability in, then any individual variable is hard to optimize for. And people don't really roll a bunch because of starting gear. I noticed like it's interesting. So like I do think there's definitely I'm surprised sometimes where players are just like, oh, I'll vibe with it, right? Like I got a weird thing as the tinker this run, so I'm gonna do it. On the other hand, like I do think because like the win-loss, the tactics, the making a difficult game, going back to what we said earlier, you get so much out of it because you you create the ritual, you slow down, you let players make meaning of their experience. You don't let them. If I can just go into a game and like zoom through the possibility space, it feels bad. It doesn't feel earned, right? It feels, and so often difficulty is the gating mechanism there. But then to do the difficulty, you're often applying these metrics of success and fail, which are like which pressure players into choosing optimal
No,
strategies. So it's a tension that's really
true,
like hard to work with.
true, true.
Yeah, I mean that's I mean for me if it's hard I leave. So that's why I was very happy to see the easy modes coming into these games. And that's I
Mm,
mean that's a general like game design thing when you have player feedback. I mean your players are often going to want to make the game harder and harder because they're good at it. But then you end up cutting out new people. So it's very difficult to manage that kind of feedback.
yeah.
And that's why settings are nice. I mean, you can just occupy both worlds, and the same is true of the things we've been talking about. I mean, you can kind of if you can work it in, you can have vast kind of configurations, and there's really not much of a downside to that. Aside from a bit of coherence in the kind of messaging and so forth that comes out about your
Mm.
game because it becomes many things to different people.
Yeah, and I do think it's interesting because you mentioned the wander mode. Like, I don't have actual metrics on this. I mean, we could probably look at them, right? But like, just from hearing people talk, not a ton of people play wander mode, but I think it is my hypothesis is that there is this sense that like I'm not doing the game right if I do this. So I think I do love we did basically get it for free, right? This was a beautiful thing where we're like we have this reputation system with factions, we set it all to 0, and that's what it wanted. And then we did this little thing where you get now instead of getting XP from killing things, you get XP for like certain milestones in the game. We give you like a lot of XP and it's fun. It like plays pretty well. And we got it basically for free. So it was totally worth it. I think because it was kind of like this side solution, it suffers from that. On the other hand, role play mode, which is also this is our like middle mode from classic, it's permadeath. Wander creatures mostly don't attack you. Role play is kind of like an RPG mode where you can save if you get to a settlement. That is probably maybe our most popular mode now. Like people really attach that because we made a roguelike game that that like takes way too long to finish, and so people don't want to lose all their progress and they're okay with feeling. But you see so much discourse. It's so interesting because you see so much discussion on the forums about like people needing the okay from the community that they can play well. You're not doing it wrong. It's okay. You can. I would really suggest playing it this way. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I found I play role play mode, and I found yeah, I mean, it's like wander mode gave me kind of a twin sons of gravity for role play mode to operate on, because then I thought more about oh, I can befriend several factions just for vibes. Like I just did it for vibes. It wasn't to try and min max an encounter or something, like getting rid of trolls or something so that I could have an easy time in one part of the game or whatever.
Mhm.
But just no, I just wanted these. I don't even remember what it was, but I just wanted these little guys to be my friends, and
Yeah.
that was wander vibes. That was pure wander vibes.
Yeah. I love it.
That's
That's great.
awesome.
That's
Mhm.
happy to hear it.
Yeah. So I think yeah, if the unless there are final thoughts, I think we're winding down here. If that is acceptable to all three people in the room. And so I'd just like to thank everybody for listening to the discussion here, and go check out TactiCon. Bunch of games, so many games. All of ours games is there, and lots of others of games with procedural generation and not. And yeah, go enjoy yourselves. So yeah, thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go play those games. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.